I don't want to take away too much time, but I do want to, kind of introduce Matt, who is with us today, Matt Barkdull, and what he does. So, Matt Barkdull is a licensed marriage and family therapist, and he holds an MBA in strategic management. He's also a certified medical family therapist. He's a professional speaker. He's also a nationally published author and a consultant. Matt owns his own speaking publication and consultation business called Paramount Integrated Solutions. He's currently on the clinical mental health team at Center for Change in Orem, Utah. Matt has taken a special interest in studying grief and loss during and after a series of personal medical crises, including hepatitis C treatment, two kidney transplants, cancer, advanced West Nile virus, and severe hemophilia. So let's turn the time over to Matt to talk a little bit about grief and the ethics of moving clients through pain. Matt, the time is now yours.
Well, thank you, Joseph. I appreciate that. And welcome to everybody who has come in. I don't mind putting in that little resume of the medical complications that I've had through my life. I just end up talking to my wife and say, at least I'm cute. So the more that funny little it's not so much funny right now, but kind of back in the day, this was the last major hurdle that I had with my health crises was about 10, 15 years ago. So the first half of my life was pretty rough. But fortunately, right now, doing a lot better. But as Joseph indicated, I am super excited about this topic, and I appreciate everybody being here. And as he indicated too, I am very happy to take questions throughout if you want to use the chat feature. I'm so glad that they're kind of monitoring that. And overall, I'm just, like I said, this interesting topic of grief, especially looking at the ethics part of it, has a lot of meaning to me. So as we're stepping through this, I am excited to be able to hopefully give some maybe new perspectives. But we're living at a kind of a time right now, especially in our pardon me community, where we've had seen lots of opportunities for mental health providers and others to console not just our own families with some of the difficulties that have been surrounding us, more of the more known ones, but also the clients that we are and our patients that we're working with. So, what I'm hoping to accomplish today is to be able to have an opportunity where we can have a really good chat about what this is and how we can kind of step up our game on how we can best serve those around us. I think this is one of the common things that we're going to find with people that we meet with is that everybody is experiencing some kind of grief, whether it's something historic, whether it's something more recent, or it was kind of the catalyst to be able to bring somebody in. I think this is, like I said, a good opportunity to be able to touch base with these things. Well, a couple of things, just kind of housekeeping things. This is just a funny disclaimer, just indicating that I actually am an employee, as Joseph indicated, of UHS. And I own my own organization called Paramount Integrated Solutions. So, as a courtesy to everybody, this is not a UHS presentation. This is through my private business, Paramount Integrated Solutions. And so the positions that I'm taking are mine. While well researched and documented, they are still at the end of the day mine and mine alone. It does not represent anything from UHS. So please just kind of keep that in mind as we're going through that. It's the legal business part of me where I thought that was probably necessary. Just a couple of objectives as we typically do as we're kind of going through this. Excuse me, I'm playing with buttons here. So really, it's to understand and practice the principle of post-traumatic growth. I don't know if anyone's heard about that, but I'm excited to share it. It's kind of an older researched model that I think would be very, very helpful at this time. Discern the best timing to ethically implement specific therapeutic strategies within a client's grief journey. This is, like I said, an ethical based conversation and presentation. So while we are very, very excited to be able to work with those who are grieving, we also have to understand there's some ethics surrounding that. So it's kind of a discernment of what are some of the pitfalls and some of the traps that we can fall into as we're trying to work with this population. And lastly, really, it's understanding the significance of implementing a collaborative approach to grief work. Um, as I'll show a little bit later on, you may be really fascinated to learn that one of the best approaches that we can take is to encourage a client and or patient to bring in a social support as they are going through grieving. That actually is probably the largest predictor of success in working through and progressing on their grief journey. So for that matter, ooh, look at that handsome guy. Yeah, well, that's me a few years back. I don't think I have to go through this very much. It was already indicated. I happen to be a licensed marriage and family therapist and have gotten several certifications throughout the time. I am a professional speaker, meaning that my private organization allows me to be able to speak quite a bit throughout the nation and worldwide sometimes. Also a published author. But more importantly, like I said, going back to this funny background as far as myself is that I too have been in a constant state years and years ago of grieving loss. Now, this is not necessarily loss when it comes to death, but as you can kind of see, I've had a few medical concerns over the years. And based off of those, I have kind of dedicated my life to be able to help people in similar situations, but especially when they're going through the grieving process. So that I call myself not a medical survivor, I call myself a medical thriver. It's something I've always wanted to do. I've always wanted to be able to pick myself up and be able to have the opportunity to be able to bless the lives of others as others have blessed me throughout my life. So let's just kind of dive into grief a little bit, everybody. First of all, I want to set the tone. And I don't know if anybody has heard of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. If when you get the PowerPoint presentation, hopefully from Joseph in the near future, you'll have access to all of my notes with the presentation. So you are welcome to see everywhere where I'm grabbing these quotes. But this really kind of sums it up for me. If anybody knows Dr. Kubler-Ross, she was a very well-known grief researcher. And she says this, the reality is that you will grieve forever. You will not, quote, get over the loss of a loved one. You will learn to live with it. You will heal and you will rebuild yourself around the loss you have suffered. You will be whole again, but you will never be the same, nor should you be the same, nor would you want to. So if you can kind of get an understanding of a different perspective of grief that I'd like to introduce is that human beings do have the capacity to not only move through the process and the journey of grief, it doesn't necessarily mean we're the same afterward. And in most cases, we would not want to be the same because of the journey itself. And oftentimes the journey being as rough as it sometimes is literally changes us. So let's just kind of get some academics out of the way. Most people know what grief is. So let's hit the APA dictionary. This is the second edition. It says grief is the anguish experienced after significant loss. Usually, and if you kind of get the idea here, it's usually the death of a beloved person. Okay? This is what the academics and the DSM focus on when it comes to pathology, if you will, is that they very much focus on death. So when it comes to this, this is just one aspect of grief, but it often includes physiological distress, separation anxiety, confusion, yearning, obsessive dwelling on the past, and apprehension about the future. Okay, so I don't know if people are aware, but the new 2022 version of the DSM-5 has a new diagnosis that is called prolonged grief disorder, or PGD. So what that is specifically is it has to center around death. It's not loss of a job. It's not, you know, the loss of safety or a medical condition. It has to involve death. So it's specifically and exclusively tied to the death of a close person. And if you think about it, the central symptoms is, of course, what you would kind of guess that any kind of diagnosis that you would find in the DSM, there's that level of persistency that it has to be there. It's this level of intensity, how much it interrupts our day-to-day lives. So the central symptoms, persistent yearning, preoccupation, disbelief, identity disruption, all revolve around the loss through death. And if you kind of look at the bottom, it says that too. The symptoms are one, persistent, they're pervasive, and they're disabling. Like I said, somebody can experience an emotion of depression or an emotion of discouragement, but if they're not persistent, pervasive, and disabling, they tend not to get diagnosed with a depression and or an anxiety or any other kind of thing. This grief disorder, prolonged grief disorder, for adults, they have to be grieving and having those same symptoms for well over a year. I believe it is 12 months. For children or minors or adolescents, it is 6 months. So if you look that up in your new and revised 2022 version of the DSM-5 TR, you'll notice that that diagnosis is there. So FYI, and we'll address that a little bit more through this presentation. Okay, now let's do adaptive grief a bit. Sometimes it's called non-clinical grief. Sometimes it's called normal grief, if you will. But grief is basically, in and of itself, the normal and natural reaction to loss. And now this is any kind of loss. We're not just talking about death. It is not a pathology to be cured, but a process to be lived, felt, and interestingly, I love this wording, and eventually integrated into one's life. So if you kind of look at this definition based on some of the other definitions, I think you'll find it interesting about, it's like I said, the emotion versus the diagnosis or the quote illness or problem of whether it's an anxiety, a fear, a depression, a discouragement. Grief in and of itself is what we're going to say normal. Prolonged grief disorder, for instance, is not normal. This is where we would need to be able to jump in and do some good work with them. But even people come into our offices not necessarily struggling with prolonged grief disorder. They may be experiencing classic grief in and of itself. So we have to understand, and as we kind of get into this presentation a little bit more, I think we'll be able to find that there are lots of different ways to be able to say what is what. They might still be struggling with something even a year after, but what is the diagnosis? What is really, really going on with the person? Okay, so jumping ahead, just a little bit about this presentation. This applies to all forms of grief and loss. Okay, so death, finances, employment, health, divorce, safety, reputation. If you kind of think about it, how many times are we going through a grieving process that really doesn't have, or just kind of pertains to almost every aspect of our lives? We find ourselves in grieving. It may be short, it may be longer, but this is just a quick sampling, if you will, on some of the forms that grief and loss comes with. And like I said, the person doesn't even have to experience the loss themselves. For instance, with the Charlie Kirk's shooting a week or so ago, a couple of weeks ago, the interesting thing about that time is that many people that I've seen in my clinical office, they're coming in indicating that they don't feel safe at all on account of what's happened. People that are halfway across the country. I did a presentation in Atlanta last week and in Charlotte, North Carolina. And in those places, they're talking about, what's happened and that they're struggling with some of these things. Okay. In a grief kind of way, in a loss kind of way. Not just with I'm scared, I'm afraid this is going to happen to me, but no, it's actually a grieving kind of a situation. That loss is impacting on a secondary, even tertiary level. So, like I said, grief doesn't, as you know, doesn't involve that this is directly happening to a person, but it can be a one-off, if you will. Okay, so let me just talk to you about just some of our local issues that have taken place recently and over the past little bit. As we all know, the Charlie Cook shooting at Utah Valley University. My wife just yesterday indicated that a beloved Black Ridge Elementary School teacher in Harriman, where she works, died suddenly. And uh, so many of the students and the teachers are doing all sorts of things. There's a number of grief counselors going over from the Jordan School District to that elementary school, working with kids, and they're busy. They have 7 to 8 grief counselors over there, and they're busy. They're working with people. They're working with teachers. They're working with students. They're working with staff. It's quite amazing. It's wonderful that the community is coming together like that. COVID-19. Okay, there was a lot of grieving that took place, lots of loss that happened, and to this day, there are people that still struggle with the aftermath of that, whether they got COVID-19 or not, or they lost a loved one during that time. I don't know if people remember the different windstorms that took place in northern Utah, 2011 and 2020. Okay, like I said, these are just a sampling of things that are just kind of in our own backyard here in Utah. Flooding from 2005 to 2006 in St. George. One strong and really unfortunate situation was the disappearance of Susan Powell and the aftermath and murder and suicide of Susan's husband and sons in West Valley. To the left is a picture of that family. And so this is horrific stuff. There are people that are not just scared, which typically is not a grieving kind of indication. But the thing is that we have to understand the many different forms grief can come in. For instance, PTSD, is that what we're dealing with? Can somebody be grieving and have PTSD at the same time? Or have anxiety or struggle with generalized anxiety disorder or major depressive disorder? See, these are some of the tasks that the clinician has an opportunity to be able to jump into and look into and assess. And by so doing, the ethics that kind of come up from doing that. So I'm sure people can add to this list of all sorts of things that you're aware of. And people that have come into your offices for clinical services or students or whoever your clinical interface looks like. We have a chance to be able to have these issues occur on many, many different levels almost all the time. Okay, let's just, with every presentation, I'm always interested in some fascinating facts. I did a little research here. So grief activates the same brain regions as physical pain. That may be interesting to us because, again, like I said, people often say to me, especially when a deep loss, unexpected loss, is that they have come to me on numerous occasions and actually said, this hurts. And they're not just talking about emotionally, they're talking about physically. This hurts. And with this recent research about the brain, it's activating that same brain region. Um, Interestingly enough, grieving can increase inflammatory markers, which are linked to heart disease and other ways that lowers immunity. Uh, some say that the adrenaline and cortisol release, with an abundance of that through lots and intense grieving, actually can cause sickness because of the inflammatory response. And with inflammatory response, you know that that leads to lowered immunity, which means you can catch colds, you can get flus. And the fact is that with people with heart or other kind of pre-existing conditions, can be a huge issue. Grief can often come in waves rather than stages. I want you to remember that, everybody. Okay, this is not linear, and most people understand that. But rather than linear, it may come in just different waves and just rush of emotion, sometimes without people really expecting it to happen. A lot of people say that I was doing well for a few weeks, but man, I don't know what happened, but I just was thrown on my backside based off of something that triggered some kind of recollection or something. You know, it just happens that way. Grief can become a catalyst also for deeper life purpose, compassion, and resilience. And this is part of the presentation too, is not necessarily trying to get people to that point, but many people have been able to study that this is something that can be used for and give an opportunity for people to be able to rediscover themselves in many ways. It can actually increase resilience. And a lot of time when people experience loss, they turn it into almost a life goal or a life purpose or a life mission statement. Social support is one of the strongest predictors of healthy adjustment. That's why one of the big objectives of this presentation is to really highlight that social support above and beyond what a clinician can do, what a doctor can do, what a treatment team can do. That social support, if someone is grieving in isolation, that's probably the worst thing that they can engage in. You know, people want their space, of course, but the more that we can encourage social support, it's a huge, huge opportunity to be able to help them through some of those difficulties. Just a few more. Sleep disturbance is a strong predictor of prolonged grief disorder. Let's talk about kids a little bit. The research shows that they puddle jump. What that means is they are in and out of grief. Like they're playing, they're happy for one moment, and they're bawling their eyes out, crying the next. Now, children also need repeated conversations about death. One is not enough because with their developmental nature, their cognitive development especially, and you know, the way their minds work and their brains work, they're still processing the idea of permanence. They may say on multiple occasions is when is Grammy coming over, or when is this happening, when is this happening. Some people think that they are simply just kind of in denial. uh, it's not so much denial from what we're finding in the research. What we're finding is that they're still processing the idea of permanence with their developmental mindset. Okay, so that's something to kind of remember if you're working with children, is, and in a family therapy setting, being able to encourage parents to be patient with them and needing to repeat conversations about death. We can do that. Grief rituals across cultures. You know, I don't know if you've done any research in this area, but it's fascinating what different cultures, whether it be in Africa, whether it be, um, oh goodness, there's a tribe, oh, is it New Guinea? I can't remember exactly, but you know, oftentimes you see, and New Orleans is kind of famous for getting a jazz band or um, kind of using music as a huge healer while they're parading the coffin down the street. So there's weeping. Some people wish to be able to remain silent. That's actually cultural. Ritual dancing. There's a number of different ways that people do this. And by the way, grief is not always, and this should be a does statement, but grief is not always about death. but it shows similar emotional and stress pathways with other things that create someone to grieve. Like I said, divorce certainly can do that. All of these things that happen when we are losing jobs, or even something that may not be quite as what we would consider impactful. But as we're grieving, this is an opportunity for us to be able to take a step back and just say, let's not talk about grieving and death only. There's so many different ways that this can manifest itself. Okay. All right. I promise this. You ready for this, guys? We got some ethics. Ethics. I'm going to go through these very, very specific, but let's just kind of look at a few of the problems. I'm just going to highlight 7, probably of the most common ethical concerns. First of all, clinicians tend to normalize or pathologize, I should say, what we would call adaptive or normal grief. It's very, and sometimes it's to be able to, satisfy the insurance to give them a diagnosis or something, you know, but all too often when people come in and are just devastated, and for a while, maybe they're not eating very much, they're having difficulty sleeping, in a sense, those are actually quite normal. Rushing the process or trying to fix it is the absolute opposite thing that we should be doing. Now, some clients come in and want a quick fix. It's rare though. We tend to see people who are struggling and they're just needing to talk it through. Clinicians tend to want to jump in and fix it. Oftentimes, we overlook cultural and spiritual dimensions. One of the most important things that people can do is to be able to really jump in and really highlight and understand, what kind of what does this death mean, or what does this job loss mean, or what does this culturally mean by what has happened to you. Part of the assessment should be some strong cultural and spiritual dimensions. Okay, so minimizing or avoiding grief conversations. It's interesting that most clinicians, when they become licensed or they graduate from graduate school, or whatever their situation is that oftentimes they don't like having hard conversations, meaning they tend to minimize or even avoid talking about the very thing that that client is wanting to discuss. Or if they're talking about something different, like depression or other kinds of issues, it's oftentimes hard for them to take the issue of grief and really give it some good meat and some good discussion. So that's a piece of it that we need to understand a little bit more, because we have to be able to be willing to be able to jump in the mud, if you will, with the client and understand what they're going through. Okay, oftentimes we tend to solely focus on symptoms instead of meaning. Now, at the very beginning, it's okay to be able to hit those symptoms, because if someone is experiencing suicidal ideation, for instance, or if they're self-harming, or it's been several weeks where they're not eating, obviously we want to focus on that. But we're talking about solely. We want to get them to the point where we can talk about what's called meaning, and we'll discuss that a little bit more. Okay, failing to differentiate grief from comorbidities. Okay, so in other words, we're going back to this pathologizing, but is someone's grief an offshoot, if you will, or an underlier to PTSD, to depression, to anxiety? So we have to be able to understand those differentiations, and overusing manualized interventions or protocols, all that, and I'll go through kind of what that means in a little bit. So these are some really tight, strong ethical concerns. And there's others, of course, but what I've been able to see, these are some big ones that tend to kind of pop up.
Hey, Matt,
Okay,
we have a question in the chat.
please.
Uh, Paul is asking, how would you treat or help a domestic violence survivor and a child who may have witnessed this? Like, is it grief of safety, maybe of marriage and security on top of the trauma they experienced?
Exactly. And one of the things that I would quickly jump to, just from a general standpoint, is oftentimes with domestic violence and, the witness of that, oftentimes we're probably assessing a little bit more with trauma. Uh, so what this can look like, and this is one of the points where it's really important to understand the differentiation, is, are we dealing with somebody that is struggling with trauma, which of course has an offshoot to be able to, which is going to accompany some grief. But when it comes to kids witnessing, right now, they're in a trauma state. So we're not quite ready to be able to hit a lot of grief at the moment. With a trauma approach, a lot of the things that we have an opportunity to do, if this makes sense, is to make sure that, number one, that the very basics are being handled. For instance, I mean, this might sound funny, but this is really core stuff to trauma. It's the basics. Are they eating? Are there nightmares? Are there, you know, uh, is the anxiety, the depression, the aftermath, the safety, is all of those things kind of being initially addressed? A lot of times trauma work is listening work. It's being able to get rapport, it's be able to be safe oftentimes. So while we definitely get into grief, if you will, eventually we can hit those points. But at the present time, as you're going through and stepping through that, you're going to be hitting some of those things. And some of the interventions are actually a little bit similar to prolonged grief disorder. But at this point, we probably wouldn't jump into a whole lot of grief work at that time, because the trauma might be a little bit more significant, if that makes sense. And there's some great models for trauma work. Some people want to jump to EMDR. It's probably not a good time, especially acute or prolonged. I would love to hear more context about what um, the the lady had to indicate, but that's kind of more of what I would recommend at this point. Is trauma is a little different, and we would approach that differently at the very beginning. And maybe I'll answer some of the questions, because as you actually kind of see what we're trying to do, you'll start seeing some hints on what you can also do for children and for domestic violence. Okay, so let's jump into this a little bit more. So we have an opportunity to be able to talk about, oops, hitting too many buttons again. So this is the issue of pathologizing adaptive or normal grief. Okay. So first of all, we want to normalize grief as a natural adaptive response. It is okay to experience it, always. You're not off, you're not weird, you're not different. We want to normalize it, but at the same time, we also want to use careful assessment to distinguish between normative grief and conditions like prolonged grief disorder or major depressive disorder. Okay. The fact that they're coming in and they might only have a few sessions, they just, depending on the circumstances, it's okay to normalize what they're going through. Even if it's prolonged, there's an opportunity to be able to not necessarily normalize it, but be able to say that part of this experience, is natural. So focusing also on resilience and adaptation rather than the diagnosis, unless criteria are met. What that means is, what we can focus on is how to be resilient. Okay. How do we adapt? That is something to be able to use a little bit more, as opposed to being able to pathologize everything. At the end of the day, you'll get to know that person more, as great therapists often do, and supervisors that help therapists, is that they will always tell them that we're always assessing. We're always assessing. If this changes, and if we're starting to see new symptoms come up or prolonged symptoms come up, we'll have to pivot a little bit. But our focus on resilience and adaptation, is a good place to start to avoid that ethical dilemma. Okay, so we got another one here. that I like to emphasize, and that's rushing the process or trying to fix it. Okay, how do we avoid this, everybody? I don't know if you've heard of the dual process model. So think about an oscillating fan, because we're going to oscillate between grief work and adjustment to new life roles. For a little while, they're going to be really wanting to engage and really hit the grief portion of your work. But at the end of the day, too, we're also going to what's called restoration-oriented coping, which means adjusting to what life now looks like. What do I do from here? Grief work is different. So we're oscillating between these two areas as opposed to continuing to feel like we need to fix it, fix it, fix it, fix it, fix it. Grief work is more prolonged. It's story. It's helping them process meaning. The second part is that adjustment. Okay. And also, it's adopting a stance of, I don't know if you've heard this term again, it's companioning, which means we're walking alongside the client rather than directing the client. Okay. A lot of the time, it's great for them to be able to discover their meaning. It doesn't mean that, how do you feel about it? And just kind of giving vague answers, but it's almost conversational. You're walking alongside them as they're finding more new discoveries and as they're having more experiences. You're walking alongside them as opposed to directing everything that they're doing, oftentimes. And it's amazing what kind of insights that they get. And as a therapist, you're able to be there in the moment. Okay. So the other one that I really find interesting is our overlooking of cultural and spiritual dimensions. Okay. In the notes section, there are a number of culturally responsive assessments that really asks about rituals, spiritual beliefs, and mourning practices. So, like I said, I don't didn't have enough space to be able to put it here on the slide, but if you want to take a look at that, oftentimes that's probably the best thing that you can do is to have them fill out a few things to get to know them a little bit better. You can also find the questions that they ask and use them throughout. In other words, having the therapist or clinician be able to sit in and really ask some good questions and be curious and have an opportunity to be able to, while walking with somebody, is from their cultural standpoint, what does this look like? In fact, one of the things that people are reluctant to do is, and what we encourage people to do, is that therapists, invite their clients to bring their faith, their community, and their cultural values into therapy. Because I don't know if you've seen a lot of this, but it's pretty well known that spirituality, religion, faith, culture, those are some of the more promising interventions that people can engage in and connect back to in order to be able to help with a series of different mental health struggles. We definitely don't want to overlook that. That's one of the more powerful things. So, minimizing or avoiding grief conversations. Okay, how do we avoid this? Well, first of all, if you are struggling with minimizing or avoiding the grief conversations altogether, this is a wonderful opportunity, especially if you're a newer therapist or even an older one, where it's just maybe some countertransference that you're going through, an opportunity for some supervision, training, and even personal self-reflection to be able to understand, why is this difficult for me to be able to go through, and why am I having the reaction I'm going through? One way to be able to help avoid this too is some very basic things, is using that active listening, validation, creating space for silence as well as pain in order to be there. We don't have to fill up every second with noise and with commentary. Oftentimes, if you ask a question and they sit there for a few minutes, it can be difficult, but that might be one of the most important things where they're slowing down and really contemplating and thinking about this. So again, I would recommend in huge ways to be able to avoid this ethical concern is to be able to get some additional supervision. And if you happen to be licensed, that's okay. You know, we have an opportunity to do that. Okay, focusing solely on symptoms. This is where we get into integrating what's called meaning making approaches. Narrative therapy, if people are familiar with that, is a great therapeutic model that really helps with this. Okay, this is where meaning making happens. There's a saying out there that you are more yourself when you write. In other words, you cannot write much with your limbic part of the brain, but it's a strong indicator of your prefrontal cortex. So, journaling or guided memory work is really, really helpful to be able to help clients work through um, and reconstruct, if you need to, a life story that includes the loss. So, narrative therapy is a great model for that. And there's some notes, some indicators that are really good in the notes section that I think would be beneficial for people to understand. Um, Differentiating grief from comorbidities. So, honestly, this is where assessment comes in. We're conducting thorough differential diagnoses to distinguish grief from depression, trauma, like was asked a little bit ago, or anxiety. You know, recognizing that grief can coexist with comorbid conditions requiring separate interventions. Okay, so too oftentimes people might do the opposite as far as pathologizing. They might see this as, well, this is normal, where their reaction and what they're going through is actually different than what would be considered normal. That's where we need to be able to jump in and have some additional assessment to be able to understand what else is going on. Otherwise, we're giving people a strong disservice. Now, this overuse of manualized interventions, in other words, what this means is we are flexible, meaning that we don't have to necessarily just jump in and say, okay, I'm going to approach this specific person from a very strong, meaning oriented grief therapy model. Well, they're evidence based, they're good, but what is the person coming with right now? Are they ready for meaning making? This is a chance, an opportunity to be able to intervene and to be able to assess and be able to see where they're coming from. And then we can be flexible in our approaches. Maybe there's a good cognitive behavioral part of this. So, in other words, tailor interventions to individual client needs, their culture, their context. You know, oftentimes we don't necessarily need to be able to, pull something out of the hat right away. Because if we combine structured interventions with narrative, group, or ritual based approaches, flexibly, I think you'll actually find that the approaches and the flexible use of those can be a real blessing as you're continuing to work with that person. Okay, so I only have about a few minutes. I want to end about 10 to 5 to the hour. So I do want to introduce this idea of post-traumatic growth. Okay, and by the way, this is something that is incredibly powerful, but it has its limitations in some ways that I'd like to help people understand. So we're promoting growth to a grieving, weary world. Okay. In a perfect opportunity, we love to be able to see people grow and advance. Now, this is a very long, I won't go through this, but this is a something that I've researched highly on identity. And a lot of this has to do with being able to align with identity. So quickly, this concept of post-traumatic growth was studied in the 1990s by a couple of psychologists. Okay, what this is really is that while trauma and grief can definitely shatter one's worldview, you can rebuild and you can lead someone to growth beyond even pre-trauma functioning. Now, one thing that we want to be able to understand is that PTG is not universal. Not everyone experiences it, but it is documented as a phenomenon across many populations, including survivors of loss, illness, etc. Okay, that's one thing they have to understand. That's why we don't want to fix it or push people too much. That's a huge ethical concern in this population. Okay. So PTG is not the absence of distress. Okay. Post traumatic growth is not the absence of distress. Growth and ongoing pain often coexist. You can still experience immense amount of growth with pain that still exists. Okay. It is not forced positivity, meaning we're not sitting there telling the client that you should grow from a trauma, or grow, you should learn something from this. You don't say that, you know, that can be actually harmful. Okay. It's best understood as a potential outcome, not an expectation. Okay. Sometimes we're trying to get people back on the road again to be able to adjust, and maybe that's enough. But post traumatic growth happens in this kind of way. Okay. And again, I would have you really look at this a little bit. It's a great way to be able to help somebody. So, first of all, we want to validate distress and normalize grief. Acknowledge trauma as deeply painful, not something to get over, you know. So if you look at this, I can, using the reflective listening to validate suffering, normalize grief reactions as part of a human adaptation. Okay, we can validate distress in those kinds of ways. Oops, I'm having too much fun here. It makes you sense you feel this way. It makes sense that you feel this way. Grief tells us that someone or something mattered to us. We want to validate it, but we also want to normalize certain things. Again, we're not going to normalize something that's pathological, but we are going to normalize the part of grief that is natural. Okay, facilitate meaning making. Help clients reorient to a new way after loss. In other words, use journaling or narrative therapy. Write your story of what happened and how it means now. Has this changed what feels most important to your life? Using metaphors, rebuilding, replanting, or reconstructing a life story. If you can get them into some meaning making, guiding clients to reconstruct their meaning, their identity, and their worldview is really important as they're kind of practicing and going through this. What we're doing here with post-traumatic growth is actually helping them to be able to not only take an approach where they can, live better lives and, less distressed in many ways, but it's also to be able to help them not push their way through, but be able to understand meaning, especially away from death. Let's talk about a job loss. Okay, you're ruinous to your family. Okay, is that exactly what happened? A lot of cognitive behavioral therapy is really important, as people kind of interpret themselves from a loss. That's difficult. Help clients move through spinning through reflective exploration. Okay. In other words, we're shifting from the intrusive to deliberate rumination. So what I mean by that is cognitive reframing. So the therapist might say something like, what do these thoughts show about your need for safety, connection, or meaning? Or using open-ended prompts like, what new understanding are you beginning to see through this? Okay. Instead of these intrusive thoughts coming in, we take the reins. We help clients take the reins, and we help them to deliberately ruminate. Controlled. That's not based off of depression or anxiety, but they're journaling, they're engaging. We want to help them feel less stuck, if you will. Strengthen the social support. Here we go again. Emphasize relationships as protective and transformative. In family sessions, invite open discussion about a shared loss, recommend grief support groups, spiritual communities, peer mentoring. These are some essential things. We might see them an hour per week. That's not enough. We need to be able to help them develop an outside treatment team that's not necessarily professional, but is social oriented based on their values. Some people say, well, I don't like to be around people. Well, that's usually a manifestation of depression or anxiety. Not always. They might really be more reclusive. But the thing is that in many ways, most people will want that social understanding, that social piece of their healing. Now, like we said before, we're exploring spiritual and existential themes. Respect and invite spiritual exploration without imposing your own beliefs. Okay, encourage rituals that are meaningful to them, whether it be writing letters, doing acts of memory. Sometimes people name people after a foundation that they're creating. Open pathways to transform spiritually is a great opportunity. I love this question. Given what happened, what does living fully mean to you now? If you want a great segue to be able to get into their identity a lot more and their values, connect them back to those values. How has this loss affected your sense of purpose or beliefs about life? Those are rich questions that pull them back into understanding. Anytime that I have an opportunity to be able to reinforce a strength, resilience, I call it out. You know, list ways the client has endured or adapted so far. Highlight survival and growth capacities. What are they doing? Metaphors, acceptance and commitment therapy is always nice with this is, the resilience of redwood trees after a fire or certain kinds of pottery that are just beautiful. Imagine yourself 5 years from now looking back on how you grew. Get them out sometimes of what's going on right now and kind of project for a little bit into the future is always an interesting idea. Now, of course, we're talking again about applying evidence-based grief and trauma models. If growth is being blocked, go back to those. These are some very nice and nice oriented based opportunities where we can actually get into complicated grief treatment. If you have an opportunity to learn some of these models, I would highly recommend it. They're so powerful. The goal, tailor interventions to clinical needs while leaving room for natural adaptation. People will get stuck in this kind of work. It happens. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're in a place where they're going to continue to feel awful. And finally, model hope without pressure. Offer hope as an invitation, never as an expectation. Many people discover new strengths in the aftermath of loss. If that ever happens for you, we'll explore it together. Normalize that growth is possible through this. It very much is. It may look different for different kinds of people, but we're modeling hope. We're continuing to talk about it. We're not pressuring them through that. Like I said before, we're walking alongside them, if that makes sense. So here's a quick summary. I don't have time to quite go through that, but like I said, we're going to have an opportunity to be able to give you guys this PowerPoint, to be able to look at it. This was kind of a quick summary of just a whole field that I think is rich with possibility. But it is moving people from a point of pain to purpose. But even though they might establish their purpose, they might still be experiencing pain, and that's okay. That's okay. If they didn't experience pain, you kind of have to wonder at the end of the day, how deep was the loss? And how much at the end of the day are we going to pull ourselves into a place where we are just trying to move forward? So the fact is that it's okay in many ways for people to experience that. So that's me. Like I said, I present quite often on topics like these. This is to you guys as professionals who are doing such extraordinary work in the community. Thank you for that. There's no doubt that there's some great stuff happening. And I hope that this has been helpful to you at the end of the day. If you would like to contact me or if you have need for a presentation on any subject, we have about oh goodness, nearly 100 different presentations, in me, I should say, that have been developed. But if I can be helpful to you or helpful to your organization or present or, whatever that might look like, please feel free to reach out. I'm so happy to be able to be of assistance to you. And I'm very happy to answer any questions if we have enough time, Joseph. I haven't been looking at the time.
We definitely have time. Does anyone have any question that they wanted to ask Matt before he leaves today? You can either drop it in the chat or you can just unmute yourself and go ahead and ask.
So how can you tell the difference between trauma and grief when it's trauma-based episodes that they are experiencing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I appreciate that. Yeah, trauma and one thing that I would always recommend is to be able to look at those definitions. So I'm not going to just pan it off to the DSM by any means. So one way to absolutely look at trauma, is first of all, and like I said, there's some overlap here, but there are differences. So one of the things that I always have people understand is that have some of these things happen. What we tend to see is that trauma. Well, let me go back on this. Trauma can exist and can be there for many, 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 many years, whether it's chronic trauma, whether it's acute trauma, those kinds of things. Usually trauma based, you're going to start seeing some interesting symptoms come forward. But the thing is they're usually a lot more pronounced. So if I were to be able to tell you a little bit about that, one of the major things to see when we're dealing with trauma is, first of all, an assessment that details kind of what is being experienced. So what I would say to you, Paula, is look at the background and do a really, really good assessment and be able to see some of the things that are happening. So if you look at, for instance, PTSD, okay, post-traumatic stress disorder, what you'll see in there, and if you compare it with prolonged grief, you'll see some similarities. But the thing is that with trauma, you're going to see a lot more typically heightened reactions to kinds of things. In other words, grief, you don't see kind of the anxiety as much, the jumpiness, the startled responses, the nature and the nastiness of nightmares, if you will. Now, in grief, you can see a little bit of that, but if you want to be able to, just think of trauma as grief on steroids, okay, where you are dealing with things that are impacting you significantly. You're not eating, you're not sleeping. But the thing is this might be a prolonged issue for years and years and years and years. But I would direct you to getting an idea and kind of compare trauma, PTSD kind type, and what prolonged grief is. And you'll just see that they're similar, like I said, but there's more intensity usually when we're dealing with trauma. But the thing is there's also some good assessments to also understand the difference. Like I said, a lot of times they're comorbid. Sorry, everyone, my computer fried. It's staring at me funny. I apologize. The last comment I was making is also to understand that trauma and grief are comorbid. Oftentimes you will be experiencing both of those at the same time. And how do you understand the differentiation? Like I said, there's certain ways to do that to be able to compare like to a PTSD and to a prolonged grief disorder. But oftentimes, just like depression and anxiety that are sister diagnoses, you'll usually see this as one.
Great. Any other questions for Matt before we end today?
Did someone write a question on the board?
I think we got them all.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, great.
Yeah, if there's nothing else, again, I appreciate the opportunity to speak to everybody. I really do. This has been a wonderful opportunity, and um, oftentimes this kind of a presentation usually is a few hours long, and so I appreciate the fact that we always have time constraints. But uh, I hope you're looking forward to getting the presentation. I believe it might be valuable to you as you continue to work and continue to do your wonderful work with people.
Well, thank you, Matt, for your time, for your preparation. This was amazing. And thank you, everyone who joined us today. Join us again next month. We will have a two-part CE next month, and we're generally scheduling these on the second and fourth Tuesday of every month. So mark your calendars and save your spot, and we'll be back with more exciting CEs. Enjoy the rest of your day, folks.